Thank you very much. And you brave souls coming back for the last session of the afternoon, I applaud you and thank you for being here. Also, firstly, we've been told to cut our presentations from 20 minutes to 15, so I'll cut out all the niceties at the beginning, I'm sorry, and go straight into the presentation. But I do want to thank the CBS for the opportunity to present part of my PhD research results here today. Where are we? So you've just heard a little bit about my background, and all of those experiences actually have led me to some key questions about corporate social responsibility. Is it really enough? And my experience in Bhutan made me wonder, what can GNH offer that might be more than what we get from CSR? And okay, this is much better, the visibility. So from this experience, my research questions, or two of my research questions were about Bhutan, and they were basically exploring, does the GNH philosophy influence business in Bhutan, and if so, how? And secondly, I wanted to explore what perceptions do business leaders and government leaders and NGO leaders have of CSR versus GNH, and what do they see as the value in those two concepts. So I won't talk much about the methodology, that's all in the paper that you can read afterwards. But I just want to mention that it was a qualitative method that I used, a grounded theory approach that basically uses observation and literature material, any meetings, conferences that I attended in the time that I lived here in Bhutan, but also interviews that I conducted with leaders here in Bhutan are part of the data that I collected. The interviews I conducted here were, I did that in 2014-15, so the information is already a couple of years old almost, but still relevant, I think. And for context, I just want to outline the GNH dimensions that I consider when I talk about GNH, so that you know what it means to me when I say GNH in business. So there are the development philosophy and the frameworks, like the 4 pillars and the 9 domains that are very often talked about and everyone knows about. The measurement and assessment tools like the GNH index and the policy screening tool, and now the GNH of business certification tool. But the two elements that aren't really often covered or considered, they are mentioned sometimes, but the ones that really interested me were the personal practices of individuals in relation to GNH. And Neil mentioned he sees it as the goals and his own actions. So that's one thing, and the other is the values and ethics that come with GNH is what interested me in my study. So the terms that I'm referring to in this talk are corporate social responsibility, which is described by Matten and Moon as a cluster concept which overlaps with such concepts as business ethics, corporate philanthropy, corporate citizenship, sustainability, and environmental responsibility in business. So it really means everything, everything to do with looking after the environment, after people, society, and the business conduct, the daily business conduct as well. So in the literature and research about CSR over the last 25 years, there have been a number of phase models that people have developed where they've said, actually, we think there are phases that companies go through when they engage with CSR or start on this journey. This model by Dunphy et al. Suggests 3 phases, and it suggests a progression from the first phase where companies reject the idea of CSR altogether, either because they don't know about it or they're not interested. And then the second phase is when they're starting to manage their risks and they're trying to reduce costs or they're trying to gain a competitive advantage. And this is what I call conventional CSR businesses or conventional CSR practices. They're based on the business case, so they're improving the business profitability, and they're the reason for engaging in those activities. Then they're also this is where compulsory and voluntary standards come in, and since we're talking about a certification and GNH certification, I just wanted to point out that in the literature, it's actually considered that compulsory standards perpetuate or foster a risk management approach to CSR, and voluntary standards foster a sort of a strategic competitive advantage approach to CSR. Then what in this model is called the third phase is really sort of a transformed business that all of a sudden magically, having gone through this journey, a business becomes a business for good, and it contributes to societal well-being and to planetary well-being. And this is what I question. I question that there is a direct link or shift that companies can make, and I will explain why I'm questioning this. Because this shift really requires something fundamental to be very different. So, since we're talking about GNH and happiness, my interest was to explore the worldviews according to how we try to achieve happiness. And I also studied social change and systems change methodologies or theories. And this fundamental shift that is required to shift from the conventional CSR approach to a beyond CSR approach really requires a shift in mindset or in worldviews, really. And so a worldview is a unique arrangement of meaning each person builds and lives their life through. So there are as many worldviews in the world as there are people. So each of us has our own worldview because we have our own experiences. We've grown up in different cultures. But there are also, I guess, cultural patterns that can be named or can be called paradigms. And so I was interested in how these worldviews, what worldviews exist or what patterns of worldviews exist. And I did a literature review of Eastern and Western philosophies going back 2,000 years, and I tried to find how different philosophers and traditions made meaning of living a good life or how to achieve happiness according to them. So this may seem very simplified, and I apologize for this, but summarizing or synthesizing a 200-page literature review into this diagram, I'm trying to say that there seem to be three archetypes of trying to achieve happiness according to the philosophies that I looked at. One of them is about self-interest, so that we rely on external conditions and we see ourselves as separate, and the causality is very linear. We see cause and effect very linear and in a simple way, and that's how some people try to achieve happiness. The second view is a mutual interest worldview that sees the self as separate, but still in relation to others, and the causality becomes more circular, so that people realize that relatedness is very important. Happiness requires relationships and relatedness. And the third worldview that I describe as systems view worldview, or also interdependent worldview, sees the self not as separate but interconnected with everything else, with all other causes, conditions and effects. And the causality is mutual co-arising, and this should sound very familiar to people here in Bhutan. So these three types of worldviews have also an influence, do have an influence on how business operates and how business leaders operate. So with this in mind, there is a visualization of what commonly happens in a business that applies conventional CSR. So when the motivation for CSR is for reputation or for risk management or for cost saving, then we think with CSR activities we'll conduct our business responsibly and we make good decisions and we treat our stakeholders well. That's the assumption. Then we assume that that leads to good ethics and that leads to a systems or interdependent worldview. But what actually happens often in many cases, in many companies, is that a self-interested worldview takes over and it creates or causes egoistic ethics which interrupts the responsible business aspect. And the Volkswagen emissions scandal from last year or 2 years ago is a great example. VW has been a company well known for its CSR and sustainability activities for many, many years. And they decided to falsify the emissions readings in 11 million vehicles and thereby caused incredible contribution to climate change, but also thousands of people will die prematurely, at least 5 years prematurely, in many countries across the world because of increased respiratory problems because of this activity that this company decided to do. So this is a classic example of conventional CSR really not delivering on the business for good idea. And I know I'm already running out of time. How much time have I done?
You're about 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Oh, goodness. Okay. So I spoke to many people in Bhutan and, sorry, let me just go back. There were some key insights that, yes, GNH is relevant in business. So many business operators said that they actually considered Buddhist values or Bhutanese values as very important in their business. They didn't call them GNH values, and Ken Schroeder said this yesterday in his presentation as well, that he found that, and somebody else. So I think that's interesting. And people said, you know, there are varying degrees of GNH-ness in our businesses. There is no one example of this is a GNH business and this isn't. Some other key findings or interesting findings were really that the GNH influence made people set up businesses here in Bhutan with the purpose to solve a societal or environmental problem. So GNH informed their reason for going into business in the first place. Some of the challenges people identified were applying GNH in business is very high expectations. It's very difficult for businesses to live up to the GNH expectations. And this is even before the measurement tool or certification tool was developed. Especially for young entrepreneurs, I think it's very challenging. Some other key findings or suggestions were that businesses in Bhutan are actually looking for practical skills and knowledge how to implement GNH. And I think we've also heard that already in the sessions earlier. And they're looking for Bhutanese role models for businesses that can really demonstrate what it is to be a GNH business. And they're looking for collaboration and co-creating something together with government and other stakeholders. Hopefully they will have the opportunity through this measurement tool. And then the perceptions on GNH and CSR were interesting, particularly the idea that GNH was considered as a superior approach than CSR, because CSR was considered to be limited because it's focused on profit maximization, and GNH was seen to be about sufficiency, whereas CSR is seen to be about efficiencies. So some key differences here. And
Isabel, we are...
I'm out?
Yeah, you can just conclude, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'm concluding with the highest potential of a GNH business would look like this, that the business leaders actually cultivate an interdependent worldview which influences their ethics, or they use the Buddhist ethics to create a business purpose that actually solves or adds value to society, and they run their operations with working conditions that foster happiness, and they implement environmental and social improvements to their operations. So then in my paper you'll find there are a business GNH in business maturity model, which shows 5 layers of maturity that are motivated by different motivations and can be supported by different, different activities. The self-interested worldview companies that are in it for the survival or for conventional CSR require a very different approach of support than the GNH interested and engaged companies. And recommendations, I'll leave those out. And Tashi Delek, thank you very much for your attention.